Are humans evil? Do we accomplish evil acts, Matt?
I believe we do. I mean, pretty clear. If you just turn on the news, you'll see it all the time.
It seems like we human beings, that's the one thing that we don't have to learn
No.
is how to be, well, on the low end, how to be mean, how to be jerks.
Yeah.
But no one has to teach anyone how to do even greater evil, right?
It comes extremely natural to us. Children causing mischief, they don't have to be taught that. You got to teach them how to be good. Being bad becomes very easy. It's a very it's like a autopilot, really. If you think about it, if you're not really being self-aware, it's pretty easy to snap right into that sinfulness per se, missing the mark.
Yeah, and I would say that it is so prevalent and so prevalent in everything that we do that even in our stories there is always a villain.
Yeah.
There's always something evil because there has to be conflict, and there can only be conflict if there is opposition, if there is something that's evil, something that's true, something that's good, something that's wrong, and having those oppose. And that's the most basic form, right? That's the base level. It just gets more complex from there.
Hundred
Otherwise, you
percent.
don't have a good story. Like who, it ends up being one of those a day in the life blogs where someone's just doing things. Like no one watches those.
No, no, it's a story as old as time. I mean, yeah, it's that is the structure for any good story that you need to have, whether you're going to read a book, watch a movie. And that's honestly why I truly believe the Bible is the word of God, where it is the greatest epic ever written. God's story is the greatest of all time. So it makes sense.
Yeah, and definitely some of the most well known. And today we're going to talk about a story that is one of the most well known stories. I think if you haven't heard this story, that's not to make it like you're totally uninformed. Maybe that's why you're watching this today. But the story of Cain and Abel is what we're going to be looking at today. And this is old. It's obviously older than all of our modern movies and stories and books and things like that. It's an ancient story. It does take us to an account that is the first murder. And so, for a lot of us, I think we would take murder and put that into the category of most egregious sins, acts that you can do is
Yeah,
outright murder,
yeah.
right? And that's not to go into the nuance of self-defense. So then people want to bring up the military. None of those things. We're talking specifically about not killing. We're talking about murder specifically.
And specifically the murder of a brother too.
It gets even worse, right? So in the
Yeah,
story, that's where that story element comes in, is to build that situation. And the Bible often does this as far as stories. There will be a story that's sort of a key story that's almost like what's one of the worst things you can do? You can kill a person. Well, what's even worse than that? You can kill your brother, right? And so it's like you take, if it's true for this big idea, then it's true for the lower ones as well. That's sort of that concept and idea. So we're going to take a look at that story today. Any other thoughts before we open this up, Matt?
no, I think you did a good opening to it. It's a great example of the two different types of avenues that we have as uh, imagers of God. You have the way of Abel or the way of Cain. Abel symbolizes faith in God, and Cain symbolizes rebellion against God and going against God's ways. So this is a great story that has the fundamentals of our day-to-day walk that we battle internally. So I love it. I'm
Yeah.
ready to go over it.
And you brought up one of the great symbols, right? There's a crossroad, not a crossroads. There's a fork in the road. You can
Yep.
go to the right or to the left, right? So that's sort of another big idea, arching concept is the idea of choice.
Yep.
Choose one path or the other path, and that's clearly outlined. So we'll get into it. If you do want to follow along in a physical Bible that you have, maybe you're one of those people that puts this on. You just listen. We're going to be in Genesis 4 most of this time, and so if you did want to do that, you could do that. Otherwise,
So
we'll put it on the screen though.
So I want to add that you're talking about, like you're saying, the two different ways, and that's one thing where if you get into the free will discussion, people will try to argue that we don't have free will, but free will does not mean the choice or the option to do anything you want. It's the choice or option to make decisions with what's in front of you. Like you're saying, there's two ways ultimately in our life. we can either go our way or go God's way. There's not like 3 or 4 or 5 options. There's just two. So I like what you're talking about there.
Yeah, I prefer to use, rather than the word free will, I like to use the word choice,
Yeah.
because there are some people who will argue I didn't really have an
Yep.
option. It wasn't my choice to make, and oftentimes that's really how we feel. There's no other way out than to do it in an evil thing. And I think what we would say is that there is always a choice.
Yeah, that's a good way.
Right?
Good choice. Yep.
And so,
Absolutely.
but either way, if you use free will or I say choice, we're talking about the same thing.
Hmm.
All right, so starting in the beginning here, we actually do get, as every good origin part of the story, we actually get the origin of Cain and Abel. So looking at chapter 4 real quick, looking at the first couple of verses, and I'm reading from the New English translation. So if you're reading from a different translation or looking at another translation, or memorize the story, heard the story in a different translation, it'll sound slightly different, but I do appreciate how the wording is in this. Verse 1, now the man was intimate with his wife Eve, and she became pregnant, gave birth to Cain. And she said, I've created a man just as the Lord did. In verse 2, then she gave birth to her brother Abel. Abel took care of the flocks while Cain cultivated the ground. Right there, we've got the setup, right? So who's the older?
Cain. Yeah.
It's Cain. Who's the younger? It's Abel.
Yeah.
There are actually quite a few scholars who, ancient scholars who kind of regard Cain and Abel as being twins.
Interesting.
That one was born and then the other was born.
You know what's interesting too is always the because you have the same idea with the Esau and Jacob, right? The older and the younger, and like to culture, especially back then, it was always the older brother that or the oldest that got the rewards or got the blessings. But it's cool how like God will then flip it. You see through his story against the world system or against the culture of man to his, where the younger actually gets it. Look at David. It's just cool. It's a cool little thing he does that you just notice throughout little stories.
I just want to make it that there's this strict rules to a patriarchal society or hierarchy. And honestly, a lot of the stories of the Bible actually break that. It's not really the oldest son, but in this case, we've got two. Now, also, just to kind of add some elements to the story that is not necessarily discussed but assumed, Cain and Abel are not the only two people other than Adam and Eve at this time. You read through the other genealogy, and they had lots of children. So this is the first, but as we go through the story, the idea is like that the earth's completely empty. There's just them here. That's not even the context of Genesis. There's if you think about it, there's really not much to do on the earth other than reproduce. And so as far as that goes, they're fulfilling that which God had commanded before, right? For humanity, the idea was to be fruitful and multiply, as it would say in the first couple of chapters. That was the command given to humans, was to multiply. And this is one thing that separates human beings from other created beings, right? And the animals of earth, obviously, as well, being able to reproduce. That's something that's unique to earth. It's something that's unique to humans. And so that idea of multiplying is a big part of the story. And so we see it here. They're doing that. And this is why you have this surprised sort of thing. I've created a man just as the Lord did. So again, it's this walking in this, it's that idea of being an imager of God.
Yeah.
So we see in scripture, right? So human beings, we get to image God in that way. It's not in the same type of creation that's described, but how else do you describe it, really?
Yeah. Oh no, it is. It's a form of imaging him for sure.
Yeah. So moving on, we get to the meat of the story. So that was all the setup. Oh, one last thing. We've got Cain and Abel. It says that Cain cultivates the ground. Brother Abel takes care of the flocks. So might be important to note something here, but go ahead, Matt.
Oh, just taking note that Abel is doing what God intended man to do, and that is to be a steward of the land, or steward of his creation. Be holding dominion over God's creation. And then after the fall, you have what God said, that we are cursed through working through the soil, growing and kind of just fighting for life. And that's what Cain's doing with growing and cultivating.
Yeah, and if you want to put it in kind of more modern terms, Cain has gone into the family business, right? So
Yeah.
Cain is growing from the ground. That's what Adam was told to do. He was initially told to garden, to tend, and then once they left the garden, they were told to cultivate, and
Yep.
so and that would be difficult. So Cain's gone into the family business. Abel is caring for flocks. I think sometimes people want to build some sort of strange hierarchy here. I think it's setting this up for the story. Um, but as of yet, we don't have really anything else other to say than to kind of put them in those different categories, right?
Hmm.
So verse 3, at the designated time, Cain brought some fruit from the ground for an offering. So here's the situation: they're going to bring an offering to the Lord. Here's what's interesting: God has not given any details, at least not recorded, on rules for offering.
Hmm.
They're just bringing an offering, right?
Hmm.
So in the story, they bring an offering. Um, the Cain brings what he has, which is fruit, things from the ground. Abel brings what he has, which is from the flock. Abel brings the choicest from the flock to give to the Lord. We'll just run through the story real quick. God accepts Abel's offering, does not accept Cain's. Cain gets angry. God gives a warning and says, "You need to watch out for sin." Right? This is going to fester in your heart. Something's going to happen.
Hmm.
And Cain does not heed what the Lord says. Cain then, out of jealousy, out of hate, kills his brother.
Yep.
Uh, God then goes to Cain and says, "Hey, where's Abel?" And Cain says, "Oh, I don't know. I'm not my brother's keeper." Or he says it in a question.
Hmm.
And am I my brother's keeper?
Very,
Subtitle to that
very
is
sassy remark.
very bold to sass
Yeah.
the Lord. Bold is one word for it.
Yeah.
Um, and then God says, "That's evil. The blood cries out from the ground that you've done this." And so Cain is then cursed. He's judged. He's sent out.
Yep.
Right. So that's the basis of the story. So in verse 3, we have that small account where Cain brings fruit and brings these things. So hey, Trinity, glad you're here. So that's what we have as far as that setup. Abel brings something else. So he brings a the choicest lamb. So in the big story archetype mythology kind of a thing, you have the setup where you have two opposing I was going to say offerers, but that doesn't make a lot of sense in English.
Hmm.
Those who would come and bring an offering, right? One is accepted, one is not. That is the ultimate setup for a story, isn't it?
Yep. It is. And what's
Um,
interesting too, when
yeah,
you look, because I mean, you did a pretty good job with saying how you don't get every little detail here. There's a lot left out where, like, right there at the beginning of chapter 3, at the designated time, you know, was this just something did God obviously had to have conversations with Cain and Abel before this, and there had to be some type of, um, I don't want to say outline, but Cain knew what he was doing was not what God's command. It wasn't like this accident where Cain's just walking around thinking, "Oh, I'll do this for the Lord," and genuinely having faith in God that his crops were going to be satisfying for him. There is some understanding of what God's mark is and what God's standards are, and that is what Abel provides with the offering of sacrifice. Just like the idea that he sacrificed right in front of Adam and Eve to then produce, the clothing for them, showing them that blood sacrifice now is what needs to be atoned for the sins of man. So there's a lot into that. So I am curious to know those conversations that Cain and Abel had with God about what that designated time was. What was there? Because this is obviously before Israel, where there's feasts and different types of, um,
right.
you know. So just
Yeah, we don't
a lot
have
to,
those things. It would be nice to have some of those things outlined here. All we have is a time. There was a certain
yeah,
time they're supposed to do it.
yep,
And even in, if people want to go forward in the story, uh, according to the law, you can bring fruit and grain offerings. That's totally fine. So I think some people build this hierarchy that Cain's breaking rules. I don't
Hmm.
see any indication here that Cain's breaking any rules. I think the real point here, and the reason is, part of this would be if he was, that would be stated.
Hmm.
There are no rules here stated. He's not breaking anything. And I think that's because the real point is, and honestly, I think most people completely miss the whole point of this story is that it doesn't have to do with the sacrifice. It doesn't have to do with what he's bringing. It has to do with how he's bringing it.
Yeah, it's not coming from faith.
It's not coming from faith. It's not coming from the heart. He comes and he brings this thing. And so he showed up on time,
Hmm.
but what he brought stuff. And I think it is on purpose that it says Abel brought the absolute best. So Abel used this as an opportunity to give. You look here and it says right there that Cain was angry and his expression was downcast. So two things, something inward and expressed itself outward, right?
Well, also you could see it as a way of Cain was by works and then Abel's by faith, because Cain worked his own work, his own sweat to produce those crops to bring to God. Abel just had the faith in God to shepherd the flock that he was in front of and sacrificing his best that God grew, because God obviously is the one that gave life the to Abel's sacrifice. I just, again, little thing you can see a works and then faith-based type of mindset where because Cain's not coming from a spot of faith, he's coming from a works base, and that's why he gets angry at Abel, because he's probably sitting there going, "Well, I did all this. Look, why is that's where envy and strife kind of comes from,
And I think you could possibly go there and start to talk about those things. It's just not highlighted in the story at all. It's
Oh
not a
no, yeah,
point
it's
that's
looking.
brought up.
Mhm.
So it says in verse 6, the Lord says, "Why are you angry? Why is your expression downcast?" Um, because he had done all the things that he was supposed to do, he did.
Mhm.
Except you look at verse 7, it says, "Is it not true that if you do what is right, you'll be fine?" It says, "But if you do what is not right, sin is crouching at the door. Its
And
desire is to dominate you, and you must subdue it."
what's interesting, that a word crouching, it's in the Hebrew, it's really alluded to like an animal willing to pounce on you, like a lion or a tiger ready to pounce on the prey. So
Yeah.
that's how sin operates on a spiritual level.
Well, and this is also a mirror. This is or at least it rhymes, right? If you're going to quote George Lucas, it rhymes with the other part of the story. With this, it says the situation is stated here, right? You're angry, you're downcast. Don't you know that if you do what's right, you'll be fine? But sin is crouching at the door. Exactly what you're saying. Sin is talked about like an animal. It's an outside entity,
Hmm.
right? But it's an animal. It says its desires to dominate you, but you must subdue it. This is exactly the same things that was going on with Adam and Eve. This is a mirror of the account where Eve is in the garden. Eve is responding to a beast. It really does have to do with the heart, because it wasn't until Eve said, she looked and she reconsidered. She said, "Oh yeah, the fruits, yeah, it's good." So
Hmm.
she went, she took it. So it started here in the heart, and that's what God's really indicating. And that's why I think it's important to understand that it's what God is dealing with is this thing that's starting. It starts in the heart, it starts in the mind, it starts in the soul, and then it expresses itself outward. Even in what it's saying here, as far as what Cain did, it said first he became angry, he become angry inside, and then his outward expression was downcast. So
Well,
it starts inside and goes outside.
that goes back to the book of James, where he talks about where sin comes from, that we birth it from our own desires, because that's when James is saying, don't dare accuse God of God tempting you to sin. Sin comes from within. It's something that we tempt with our own desires, and then we birth it. And I always like, because you hear people, I'm hearing it all the time, people that either left the faith or people that have questions against Christianity, where they say how, well, God created evil then, because if God created Satan and he knew Satan was going to sin, that he therefore created sin. And I love the way that Geisler talks about it, where God created the possibility for sin. That doesn't mean that he creates it. We, as the free choice, free will creatures, actually birth it by choosing that. But God doesn't create it, but he does have through the free will idea, the possibility is there. So Cain birthed it in himself. It's like you're saying, it's crouching like an animal willing to attack, because if we allow that desire in our mind to then grow, then we just brought sin into existence.
Yeah, and it's definitely something that is an external force of some kind, but that does originate internally. So it is a choice, right?
Yeah.
It is a choice to walk down that path, and that's essentially what the Lord warns Cain about. He says, if you do what's right, you'll be fine. But if you don't do what's right, sin is crouching at the door. And it's almost this cooperation, right? If you don't do what's right, then this thing happens, right?
Yep.
Then this thing which is crouching. And what's interesting is the last part here too. It desires to dominate you, but you must subdue it. This is sort of a retooling of the command to have dominion over the earth and to subdue it.
Mm-hmm.
So now there's an added element. The added element is now sin. Sin is now this other creature that's out there that is crouching that you must subdue and to dominate. So it's almost like a original plus, right?
Yep. It's internal now. Like the other subduing is external. Now you have the internal subduing.
Yeah, you look up. So that's all happening inside his heart. So, and the reason is you can read verse 8. It says, Cain told his brother Abel, let's go out into the field. And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. If you only had this, you could say it was a crime of passion. They got angry. Something happened.
Mm-hmm.
But almost, I mean, I'm not a forensic scientist. I'm not a prophet or the son of a prophet. None of those things. But I would say a lot of these sort of crimes of passion, they start somewhere else. There's something that they're premeditated in a different way, right?
Yeah.
There's fertile ground in our own emotions and our own state. And then we put ourselves in a place where that could happen, right?
Yep.
And so a lot of those decisions happen beforehand. And then, I'm going to speak as a parent. Anyone else who's watching this, you could also think about this as a parent. There's a lot of things that you start to settle into in your own heart and your own mind as far as your own kids. And yeah, we fail, but we might say things like, I'm going to be encouraging. Like, I'm going to encourage you. I'm going to protect you. You make these sorts of decisions and you sort of re-up that as your child grows. Those thoughts, those decisions, those things that you have in your heart, you make those decisions beforehand, right? And that for a lot of people becomes this framework for how they treat their children. Do we always do it well? No, we don't. We might fail in that. And we might fail in it often, but there's at least something there to where if there's an opportunity, those choices are already made. And I think that's kind of the other point, is that you already make those choices. There are other stories where someone will say, I've determined that I'm not going to do that thing. Biblical stories like the story of Daniel, he had already purposed in his heart that he wasn't going to do evil. And so then when he's presented opportunities to do evil, he doesn't. Mm-hmm. Right. You could also, to take it into a different route, comic book world, Superman, one of the main, and it's different now, but how it was classically was Superman had a set of rules for himself that he would never violate. And so what created the unique situations is he's already made those decisions in his heart. So then when you put him in a place where he has to make that decision, he now has to do something. It's like he has all power, but he has these decisions that he's already made for himself that he's not going to do. And that's where the conflict is. So you can have an outside villain, but you have an internal conflict. And that's where you get interesting stories, right? Memorable stories is probably the word that I would rather use. You have memorable stories at this point. And so, Cain and Abel is very much a cautionary tale. We don't really hear much about Abel. It's a cautionary tale to be not like Cain, right? Mm-hmm. So we go out in the field and Cain actually fulfills the thing that was already in his heart. He already was angry. He already was downcast. He did not heed the warning, and he actually fulfilled the thing that God told him not to.
Yeah, I like that great takeaway there, though, that Cain had the option to not go down. That this is a moral decision that we all have as created creatures in the image of God. We have a choice. We really do. So I do like how that's added in here. And the warning that God gives, because God obviously knows what's working in Cain's heart. He knows the hearts and minds of all of us. So he knows. What's interesting too, like you're talking about with the blood cries out from Abel coming up later, what that looks like in the spiritual, like what that means, since how like life is in the blood and all that. It's just I like to, obviously, when I'm looking at scripture, taking different layers out, and because you can hyper spiritualize everything and you can go too far one way, but there's such an amount of super spiritual aspects that we just can't comprehend right now on this side of eternity. I can't wait to have full revelation, and when we get to actually face Christ, like what is up with the blood, like the idea of it crying out, and that we are like the sacrifice of blood is what cleanses sin that we committed. Like, what does that look like? I know I'm branched off in a different rabbit hole, but it's just something that
Yeah.
I've been thinking about.
Well, and a lot of those things, these are themes that come up not just throughout the Bible. These are things that pop up just in humanity. We started by talking about in our introduction, humans are sinful. Humans do evil things, and we all do. We know that. And Cain, the story of Cain and Abel, is really, what do you do with some of those inclinations, right? So the way that the Lord positions this is something that's starting to fester in your heart.
Mm-hmm.
So what will you do? And there's a warning. There's warnings given, and are we looking and seeing those? Are we understanding those warnings, and are we heeding the warnings that are given to make proper decisions or not? And what's interesting is these are both followers of Yahweh. They both would say, I follow Yahweh as my God, and I will do what Yahweh says. One of them, we'd actually, it's really, you can't really compare Cain and Abel, right? We don't know anything about Abel other than
Mm-hmm.
he brought a sacrifice and then was murdered. Cain, though, he had thoughts and inclinations and emotions that he had and carried, and what did he do with those, right? So that's really this kind of the setup for the story. We're not given the other side, which is, what did Abel do? This is really that cautionary tale. This is what you shouldn't do with
Mm-hmm.
those thoughts and with those feelings. And so for human beings, this is a very important sort of morality setting sort of thing, and it uses that extreme evil of murder to sort of say, this is what you would do with murder, and so you should do the same thing with lying. You should do the same thing, with falsehoods. You should do the same thing with what, right, fill in the blank.
Yep.
Because if you would do this with murder, you would do it with the lesser things as well. So it becomes that template almost.
And then what you see here later with verse 9, that he doubles down. Like he God sees that he has anger in him, so he gives him a warning. Hey, sin is crouching around. Stay away. Don't allow that these emotions, these feelings that you're feeling, don't allow them to grow. And then obviously Abel or Cain allows him to grow to where he actually murders his brother. And then at that point, there's still an option in his life to then realize he's done wrong and then ask for forgiveness, but he still doesn't. He, just like Adam and Eve hid from God, he continues to run away from God. He doesn't come to God asking for forgiveness, or when God comes to him right here, verse 9, then the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? And he replied, I don't know. Am I my brother's guardian? Like the amount of, like you said it perfectly, the boldness to be able to confront your creator. I mean, obviously you're making sacrifices to Yahweh. He knows that this is God. He knows everything about him, and he's got the boldness to go, because he knows they have to. That's one thing that I do get confused with, like even the Adam and Eve story and Cain and Abel, how they don't know that God already knows. They know that God is who God is, and it's like, to have that boldness just shows the hardness of heart that Cain has, and the complete veil over his eyes that sin has now like draped over him. To be able
Yeah.
to still have that, where he still has that hard heart, where he doesn't, like right there, he had a perfect opportunity. I fell. I allowed anger and sin to overtake me. I need forgiveness. I'm sorry. There's no faith in him. There's a coldness and a callousness to who Cain is.
And you brought up a really good thing to kind of go down. Why do we? Because this does mirror the Adam and Eve part where they're hiding and they cover themselves with fig leaves, right? That's all most of the paintings of Adam and Eve have fig leaves covering their nakedness, because it's what they tried to do to cover themselves. And God's like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Where are you? Don't think I can find you? You don't
Hmm.
think that, why do you think this? And God gives them better clothing, right? So the idea is that God's the one that covers their sin, their nakedness, their shame, covers their shame. But right here it's the same. So imagine this, okay? This is Cain. When he is confronted with the Lord, he's obstinate, he's rebellious, he kind of goes against it, right? Says God says, where's your brother Abel? Now there's a choice there. And so we'd say maybe it's hubris, maybe it's pride, maybe it's something else. But think about this. What if it's something different? What if it's actually Cain, this is a, they would say that lust, we would talk about this, lust is a deteriorated form of love.
Mm-hmm.
It's it doesn't look like it should.
Yeah.
It's ruined in a sense.
It's the corruption of what, yeah.
Corruption of love. Think of this as, this is the corruption of hope. Okay? So Cain interacts with the creator. He doesn't mentally think about the fact that he already knows. So his hope is in ignorance. I hope he doesn't find out. I hope he doesn't see it. And like you said, he doubles down on it by saying, I don't know. Am I supposed to know? Almost like, oh my gosh, I had no idea, as though that's going to save him.
Yeah.
So it's almost a hope for ignorance, instead of putting your hope in a God who can deliver mercy or grace. Or if you confess, maybe, they say, I throw myself on the mercy of the court. I'm just going to tell you what I did and say, I was wrong, and show that there's remorse, and maybe the punishment will be less because of that, or something to that degree.
Mm-hmm.
So Cain hopes in God's ignorance, or the possibility of ignorance, versus hoping in God's mercy.
Yep.
Sort of a balance there, because I don't know that he's an idiot.
No, I think I think at this point, sin has now been birthed and it's blinding him. You see it all throughout life. Like sin, like Jesus refers to it, it's leaven. It ruins the whole lump. Where now that he's allowed it inside of his heart, it's a virus. It's a virus on the spiritual realm. And now that he's allowed it to birth inside of him, it is now completely overtaken him and it's blinded him. You see that with murderers. You see that in life, where people that have just become so, their conscience is seared and they've gone their own way. And that's why you see later on in like Jude and John, where they describe going the way of Cain. And that's the idea of going the way of sin, allowing sin to overtake you. You've had that decision. Cain had the decision multiple times now to choose faith and choose God, or choose his own way and choose a rebellious avenue that is sinful. And that's kind of the story of our lives. Each of us individually, we have two different avenues and two ways to go down. Don't go down the way of Cain. Don't allow sin to overtake. And that's why the scriptures are so clear with how serious sin is, and how to really, you have to extinguish it. I mean, obviously we can't fully, like, we won't be sinless, but the goal of a Christian is to sin less throughout your growth, because you start to really see how detrimental it is to our physical lives down here. And that's like the idea that James brings up with the death principle, where the idea of sin, like, it's not the idea of losing your salvation. Like, you're saved through Christ, but birthing sin brings the death principle, where it brings cursings upon your life around you. It brings death into your own life. Like, it is, sin and death are hand in hand, it's the same coin.
Yeah. Let's look at that real quick, because he does give a judgment here. So verse 10, and you referenced this earlier. Lord says, what have you done? Of course he knows what he's done. He's not asking him because he doesn't really know. He wants him to confess it, right? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground, which could be poetic, right? It's this poetic thing, like the blood is right there. It's so blatantly obvious. It's like someone yelling at me. There could be even something more specific having to do with the blood and some of those different things. And I think that's possible. It just doesn't go any deeper into this story. But it's so you can take it for just that first avenue, just for the sake of the story, to say it's so obvious what happened, right? It says, when you cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield. It's best for you. You will be a homeless wanderer on the earth. So, interesting thing. Where does the blood cry out from? It cries out from the ground, right? So what's your punishment? That ground will no longer produce for you. That ground is the ground was the what's the word I'm looking for? It was the witness. The ground was the witness that cried out against you. So the ground's not going to work for you anymore. And you say that to a farmer, what do you think that does? That's like,
they kind of that's their whole life. Yeah.
Could that be anything else? Like, you might as well just lose your life. You lose your life at that point, right? So you can't cultivate the ground. It's not going to work for you. And you're going to be a homeless wanderer on the earth. Not only that, but if you went to any other land, any other ground, you're going to have to wander. Farming and wandering don't normally go together.
No, you have to be in a you have to be in this, you have to have a base camp for farming. You're not going to. Yeah, absolutely.
And then you kind of have you have an epilogue almost like that. That's really where we could end the story. Honestly, I'll go through these last verses real quick. It says, Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is too great to endure. Look, you're driving me off the land today. So again, what we were just saying, said, I must hide from your presence. It says, I will be homeless wanderer on the earth. Whoever finds me will kill me. So this is something else. So now he's the murderer. He's like, when other people find out, what is he afraid of?
Being murdered.
Being murdered.
Yeah.
So that for us is this other part of the story where for us, normally the thing we accuse other people of is either the thing that we're guilty of or the thing we're afraid we're going to do.
Yeah, the projection.
It's a projection. It's so fundamental to human nature. If you could accomplish that thing, you assume that others are going to accomplish that thing against you.
Yep.
And so what it does is it takes sin, it takes evil, and it knocks it up one other level where now how you respond to other people is in light of your own evil.
Mm-hmm.
And so when a lot of times you say evil, and I think we've talked about this before, what we mean by evil is not just people doing the worst things they could possibly do. Sin and evil really is, it starts in the heart, like we did here. It's something that you decide to do often, or that you say is allowable for yourself, right? There's a change in your morality to say, like, this thing is okay for me to do. But then that next step is when you're going to accomplish a thing. What sin really is that here's the mark, and so then you miss it.
Yeah.
Right. So you don't quite do what you're supposed to do. You actually are supposed to do one thing that'll help other people, but instead you do something that helps yourself and hurts other people. Like there's a whole different array of putting that together, but it really is that it's something that starts in the heart that's decided it's not meeting the mark. And for most of us, we have a conscience that says I shouldn't say, or we do something wrong. And how do you know it's wrong? By how it kind of makes us feel after we do it. Right.
Yep.
And
There's
sometimes
a standard. Yep.
And it is this, I think like I just yelled at someone and called them names. I was super, super mean. I was super rude. And so part of it is you think about that, like, wow, if anyone ever said that to me, how would I feel? How would I think? That's part of that conscience thing. Right.
Yep. Absolutely.
And, Pinocchio kind of highlights this. Pinocchio wants to be a real boy. He's not a real boy. So he has an external conscience. And, Pinocchio's misadventures is really him just deciding to do stuff without thinking about the consequences. And so his conscience is running after him to try to help him, to try to tell him. It's a really interesting sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But we deal with that here. So even if you don't read the Bible, don't know God, you're not religious, we still deal with these sort of issues. And that's because it's not a unique thing to one person, one culture. This is universal to all of humanity. Because we would say it's because we come from the same origin. We come from the same God. We have this. That's why we all have the same thoughts, regardless of culture. Some of those same standards, right? Mm-hmm. And so Cain is saying, this is too much for me. Someone's going to kill me. Verse 15. But the Lord said to him, all right. And then if anyone kills you, then Cain will be avenged 7 times. So then God promises, no, you're not going to die. You're actually going to fulfill your punishment. And if anyone kills you, they'll be killed 7 times. As much, or avenged 7 times as much. How can you kill someone 7 times? Well, maybe that calamity will be visited upon their family or whatever else. It'd be 7 times as horrible, right? And it says the Lord put a special mark on Cain so that if anyone find him, they wouldn't strike him. We have no idea what that is, but they made it obvious to what it is. And then it says Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So that sort of is the end of the story there.
Well, I want to point out too, with being avenged 7 times, the 7 symbolizing perfection. So just the perfection of God's vengeance is what he's kind of showing with the 7 times as well.
Yeah, that there's no number, there's no detail that's not in there on purpose for some of those things. You're right. It is the number of perfection. So that will be done perfectly. And I think if we're to go to who is God. What does he do? If he says that he's going to fulfill something perfectly, it's going to be correct and appropriate. It's going to be done to the fullest extent that could be and should be. So, yeah, that's a good point to bring up. But with this story, like, what if you had to give one sort of one sentence? I'll give you two sentences.
Oh,
Okay,
that's tough, brother.
a
That
two
is so tough,
sentence.
man.
What is the nugget that we take with us, put in our pocket, and say, this is what we should think about with this story?
Well, I take away, don't go the way of Cain. Don't allow sin to fester inside. Don't allow that envy, strife, the murderous, the corruption of the standard of God, sin being missing the mark. Don't go the way of Cain. Don't allow that. And then instead, because now there's two ways, go in the way of Abel. Abel had faith in God. That's all we do know about Abel. Like you've said, there's not much said about Abel at all. There's no specifics. We don't see his internal dialogue. We don't see conversations with Abel and God. But what you do see with Abel, with a few verses, is his faith in God. He gave God the fattest. He gave God the best because he had faith in him to give him the best. He knew that he deserved the best. So that's what we do know. So go in the way of Abel, living by faith, just like Hebrews 11:6 says. The only thing that pleases God is faith. That's why throughout, before Christ and after Christ, it's always been faith that is what brings salvation to us humans, and that is the whole story that we all go through. Don't go the way Cain. I know it's longer than two sentences, but yeah, that's the main
Close
gist.
enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty good summation as far as you have those two choices. And so I'll bring up one verse that will sort of help me to give my two sentences. But in Proverbs, it says there's a and I'll do it from a different translation because then it falls along what we've been saying with the path. It says there's a path before each person that seems right, but in the end it leads to death. So for Cain thought he had a better way to go, which was to follow his own anger, but in the end it leads to death. Now, that death wasn't just Abel, it also kind of led to his own demise, if you want to think of it that way. He could not live that life that he had any longer, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a way that seems right, but in the end, it leads to death. And there's that word, it appears right, it seems right. And there's a lot of ways we can trick ourselves, right? So I would say when you're delivered with that choice, there's might be a way that seems right, but we really should look to see that where that path is leading us, right?
Mm-hmm.
For most, so Cain, God is the one that approached Cain. Says, "Hey, why are you angry?" At that point, if Cain had chosen instead of the path that seemed right to him, which was to fulfill the things that he felt deeply, but instead he confessed it to say, "I'm feeling this, and I need help," I know that he would have been given help.
100%. Yeah, that's
Right.
God's nature. Yep.
So again, that choice, he has essentially three times where he has that choice. Once when he's giving the sacrifice, once when God comes to talk to him, and then once when he's in the field. So he has three different opportunities to not go down that path, but he does.
Yep. And
Three times.
even though the word isn't in here, what you see is the base level of the original sin of pride, the same sin that Lucifer fell from. It's the same sin here. That's the core. It's if you go down to the root of Cain's issue is his pride. He's got a pride issue that he felt that he was worthy of what Abel had, the approval of God, and that was a pride issue. He wasn't humble in his situation with God, and then he continues to choose his path, his pride himself, going against every opportunity of him showing humility towards God and his forgiveness. And that really is, and back to the idea about subduing it, where subduing that urge of sin, it goes back to the wrestling match that we have internally between the spiritual being and the carnal being of the flesh. Whether it is the two avenues, choosing yourself, choosing your pride, choosing this life, and that's rebelling from God, or you choose God with faith and humility with him. So it's always a pride issue. Always, whenever talking to somebody, they're dealing with whatever sin, you can always stem it somewhere. That's the grounding right there of that sin. It's always a self pride.
Yeah, it goes back to originally man wants to be God.
100%.
So
That's
you can
that's
either
what
be like God
I know.
because you're with him,
Yeah,
and you learn and grow, and that was the original intention.
yeah.
Was God wanted to walk with Adam and Eve, or you can take the quick and easy path, right? So many different stories give us those options, right? Modern stories, Star Wars gives us that option. In X-Men, you almost have this. You have a similar setup with Professor X and Magneto. You have these two entities that are they started out as brothers, if you want to put it that way, but they chose a different path, so now they're in opposition to each other.
Yeah.
And so that's that dynamic. It's a story that goes on and on and on in so many different ways and so many different patterns, but we see it here first, right here. So as we're landing the plane, you're putting your tray table up. Matt, any final words before we land?
The just shall live by faith. That is that's what I live by. Habakkuk talking about it, and then Paul talking about it 3 times, and it goes throughout the entire Bible. We live by faith. Don't choose the way of Cain. Don't choose your pride. Be humble, and choose faith in your Creator. That is the gist of it.
Absolutely. So if you are confronted with that choice, and honestly, I think this is one of the things for Cain that he did not do. He did not seek any outside help, counsel, anything else. And I'll say this: I don't know in what situation you, viewer, who may have found yourself stumbled upon yourself being here, all of a sudden watching this. If you're one of those people that doesn't have someone to bounce an idea off of, or there's a way that seems right to you, but you want to look through the options, if you don't have anybody else, I mean, leave a comment here. We'll find some way to Twitter, whatever, to get a hold of just, an outside force, someone else. If you don't have that, we can be that. Right? We'll offer that.
100%.
Send a message. We'll do that. You can find me on there's links to Instagram. Matt, you're on TikTok. There's lots of different ways to get a hold of us. So if that's something, don't follow the way of Cain. Talk to someone. If you don't have anyone, you can talk to us, and we will do what we can to help walk on that path of truth. But anyway, it's been great. There's so many more things we could do with this, but I think we'll land the plane here. Maybe we'll come back to the story another time. But yeah, that's all I have.
Absolutely, brother. It was good. And I like what you're talking about. So just a little extra part where you're talking about anyone out there that's in that option, come to somebody. That's where First John talks about, where how do you break that sin? How could have Cain broke that link? Was confessing your sins to for Cain it was to God, but for us it's confessing your sins to others, to brethren, to your friends. That's how you break the chain of sin inside of you. Don't hide it like Adam and Eve. Don't hide it like Cain. Confess it, bring it out into the light so the light can expose it and destroy it. That is how we destroy sin.
There you go. All right. Well, I think we'll land the plane here for Sunday morning, and hope that all of you have a good day, wonderful day. Trinity, keep putting things up or picking them up and putting them down. That's totally fine. Yeah. Keep doing what you're doing. I think you're probably in the gym, but Matt, have a good one, sir.
God bless, brother.
Pilgrim on, my friends. We'll see you out there.
Have a good one.